Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Desiree Manzanares. I'm with the El Paso Chamber, and thank you so much for joining us today on Facebook Live. Today, we have the great honor of having Mr. Roberto Coronado. I'm sorry. He is at the Federal Reserve. He is the Senior Vice President in charge and the Senior Economist with the Federal Reserve in Dallas, who is actually located in El Paso. Am I right, Mr. Coronado?
That is correct. Yes, based in El Paso.
Perfect. So, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you. We know you're very busy, especially with everything that's going on economy-wise. I know you must have your hands full. So the El Paso Chamber, as well as El Paso Businesses Stand Together, is so happy to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to go ahead and remind everybody that this is a Facebook Live chat. So if you have any questions for Mr. Coronado while we are doing this interview, please feel free to post them. I'll be able to see them and get an answer for you. And if not, we can find the answer for you, of course. This is an opportunity for you to have your voices heard and to make sure that you guys are getting questions that you have answered. So please feel free. This is an interactive activity for us. So Mr. Coronado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I know that maybe you want to give us a little bit of background on yourself. And I know that you had a really cool presentation that you wanted to share with us.
Yes, so thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and the audience and your members and the business community in general in El Paso. This is quite an honor, and look forward to, let me pull up my presentation here. Quite an honor to be with you. And like you said, I'm an economist. I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, based here in El Paso. Our coverage area is not only goes beyond El Paso. We're responsible for southern New Mexico and West Texas, and we provide a number of different services to financial institutions. We are very actively engaged in monetary policy, economic policy in general, and quite frankly, these are extraordinary times, and so we appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you for a little bit. I do have a presentation, but before I jump into it, let me just thank the Chamber of Commerce, the Greater El Paso Chamber of Commerce. I had the opportunity to serve on the board there for some years. Now my colleague, Cristina Gonzalez, sits on the board, and over the years, we've built a very strong strategic partnership with the Chamber, and we think very highly of course, of David Jerome and all of you, the entire team. You've done a phenomenal job. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group. I would like to thank my colleagues. I see a number of them online. Molly Flores, Ruben Ajedo, Fope Idowu, they are helping me put this presentation together, as well as Keaton Allen. And we have an entire team we're learning how to do effective virtual outreach. So we appreciate the opportunity. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. If you get a central banker, he or she, of course, will always start with the traditional disclaimer that everything that I'm about to share with you today, it only reflects my opinions. They don't reflect the opinions of the Dallas Fed nor the Federal Reserve System. So I want to talk about the US economy very briefly, and then El Paso. And, quite frankly, COVID-19, the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic, it's first and foremost a health crisis, and has been with us for now a number of weeks. But as we are trying to cope with it, as we're trying to mitigate the risk to the public health perspective, we've put a lot of measures in place that clearly have an implications for the economy, for the economic outlook. So today I'm going to be talking about the outlook, and I'm going to be talking about the economy, but I don't want to lose sight of this is, at the end of the day, a public health crisis. COVID-19 the spread of it has been very unpredictable, which has created a lot of uncertainty for government officials, for business leaders, for business owners, for individual consumers like you and I. And that has brought in a lot of different changes and dynamics to the economy. So far, what we've seen in the economy at the national level, we expect a substantial contraction of economic activity in the second quarter of this year, but we expect the economy to rebound and start growing in the second half of 2020. For Texas, this is going to be a year in which we're probably going to be growing lower at a lower rate than the national level. We traditionally in Texas grow faster than the US, but there are a number of headwinds, facing Texas that will probably bring us our growth rate just below the national level. You can talk about energy markets, you can talk about trade. There's a lot of headwinds facing Texas. And for El Paso, I'm afraid we're not immune to it. I'm afraid we're going to also see the pain of this, and probably our growth rates is going to be impacted probably more so than the national and at the Texas level. So let me begin by giving you a quick snapshot of where we see the US economy. For any economy, the broadest measure of economic activity we have is gross domestic product, or GDP, which is basically the sum of all goods and services produced within an economy. In 2019, the US economy grew at about 2.3%, which was a solid pace of growth. In 2020, as we began to see the impacts of COVID-19, the last reading we have for GDP is the first quarter. That came at a contraction of 4.8%. And in here, you see the different breakdowns. Once we slice the data and see where's growth or contraction coming from, the bulk of it came from the consumer, which is the first set of bars there, PC, which is personal consumption expenditures. We basically withdrew our consumption levels in the first quarter and very likely into the second quarter, and therefore that is the driver that brought in GDP growth on a negative in a negative territory. The challenge with GDP is that it's quarterly and it's not very timely. It's dated. So then economists were trying to rely heavily on high frequency data, more timely economic data, to have a better pulse of where is the US economy doing. And this is a tool that one of my colleagues at the Dallas Fed has developed in conjunction with a number of his co-authors. And it's basically a weekly economic indicator. We update this twice a week. And the last reading we have is for at the end of last week, and we see a contraction of about 12% in the US economy, which is substantial and which is greater than what we saw in the first quarter of GDP. So it tells us that once we get the reading of GDP for the second quarter, it's likely to be much more in the negative territory. Looking into consumption, at the end of the day, the US economy, 2/3 of the US economic activity is consumption. It's driven by you and I, the consumer. I'm plotting retail sales growth. I have data here in March, which is 8.4% contraction. The data for April actually came up this morning. And so we didn't get a chance to update the deck here, but the contraction in April was actually even more pronounced. It was a 16% decline, 16.4% decline for April. And when you look across the readings, most sectors saw contraction. There's just a handful of sectors which saw growth in retail growth, which is mostly, non-retail, which is non-brick and mortar, basically online sales. And I think as many of us are going through social distancing, shelter at place, stay at home type of orders across the nation, we are relying a lot more on online shopping and for those goods to be delivered to our doorsteps in our particular homes. Looking into precisely the social distancing measures. So we have pretty phenomenal data by looking at GPS data for cell phones. And this is a way for us to see exactly on the aggregate, are people moving within communities or people pretty much stand still within their homes? And these three different readings, all of them, you see a contraction. You see a nice growth in the first part of March as many communities began with stay-at-home orders, and you see that they've remained elevated. The peak of most of these measures is around mid-April, and we've seen a gradual, a slight decline, but still elevated. And until we don't have the public health crisis under control and manageable, I would expect this social distancing will remain in effect, and this will continue to have implications for the economic outlook in the near term. Payroll, looking at the labor markets, we got last week the numbers for April, which was a colossal decline of 20.5 million jobs just in April. And it's across the board. About a third of those jobs lost in the month of April come from a particular industry, which is leisure and hospitality. When you think about restaurants, when you think about bars, when you think about movie theaters, entertainment, hotels, those are the sectors that contracted and contributed close to 7.5 million jobs lost in April in the US economy. Because of the substantial decline in payrolls, we saw a substantial uptick in the unemployment rate for the US from 4.5% that we had in March to 14.5, 15% levels. And just to illustrate, if we were to compare these levels of unemployment rate to what we saw in the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009, you can see they are much more higher. And I would expect as new data comes in, that this number for the unemployment rate is likely to continue to grow somewhat in the next couple of months. At the end of the day, this is an economy, our US economy, that it's driven by us, consumers. And so it's very important to have a good understanding of how the consumer is feeling and how confident we are about the prospects for the US economy. This chart shows consumer confidence from two different sources. And you can see there was a substantial decline in March and of this year. And again, until we don't have the confidence and until we don't have the trust that we can go out there and consume and perhaps go to the movie theaters, it is likely that the retail and the economy is not going to get reactivated here in the near term. I would not be a central banker if I don't show you an inflation chart. And inflation, there's two main takeaways here. Inflation prior to COVID was pretty much in the sweet spot for the Federal Reserve System, which is about 2%. We expect inflation to decline for the next 6 to 9 months, particularly as more slack is being created in the economy, as labor market contracts, as industrial production and as manufacturing capacity contracts. We expect that slack to basically put downward pressure on prices for the foreseeable future. Moving to the El Paso economy, there are a number of different or additional headwinds to what the US is facing. One of the headwinds is that we have a slightly higher dependence on sectors such as leisure and hospitality, which then creates a little bit more risk for a local economy. Then also from an educational perspective, we have a lower educational attainment than the US. And this is important, particularly around this time, because that tells us that the percentage of our workforce in El Paso that is able to work from home is much slower than what you would see in Texas or what would you see in the US. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. And so those are things that we need to keep in mind, that it is likely that the headwind and that the impact to El Paso might be a little bit more pronounced than for Texas and the US. One of my colleagues in Dallas, the Dallas Fed, Jishen Su, has produced a phenomenal research trying to quantify who is able to work from home. And he basically, the punchline of his research is about 40% of the workforce in the US is able to work from home. For Texas, it's about 37%. For El Paso, it's 30%. And then he slices the data on by gender, by educational attainment, by income levels, by demographic, by ethnicity. And the bottom line is for El Paso is that the lower the education attainment you have, the more likely is that you're not able to perform your job from home. And that's what I meant at the beginning, a second ago, that our lower education attainments are likely going to put additional brakes into our economic outlook for El Paso here in the near term. The other additional headwind we have is our relationship with Mexico, in the sense that as we're closing down the borders just to essential travel, there's a lot of economic activity that happens, particularly around cross-border retail, that it drives a lot of growth in El Paso, and right now it's not taking place. And this chart shows just traffic at the international ports of entry in El Paso, and we've seen a contraction so far of about 30%. Manufacturing is very important for Mexico. It's very important for the northern part of Mexico, states like Chihuahua, cities like Ciudad Juarez. And a lot of that manufacturing growth brings a lot of growth locally on this side of the Texas border. That growth is traditionally in the service side sector. So if they grow manufacturing, we grow service sectors here, services, in addition to transportation, warehousing, and logistics, but accounting services, financial services, real estate services, information, HR, staffing. There's a plethora of services service provider businesses that are based in El Paso that facilitate and accommodate cross-border retail and cross-border manufacturing. And we've seen a substantial contraction in activity in the manufacturing production in northern Mexico, in Ciudad Juarez in particular. And half of that manufacturing capacity and activity is tied to the automotive sector. And so in here, I'm also plotting, auto sales in the US, and they've declined substantially in the wake of COVID-19 from 17.5 million units per year to roughly less than around 8.5 million units. And that is a substantial contraction in demand, and therefore it is likely that the activity in Mexico, even when they are ready to open up for business, the demand may not be there for them as strong. And so that's going to put the brakes a little bit into that activity. Looking into cross-border retail, the Mexican shopper plays a substantial role in our retail footprint here locally in El Paso. We estimate, based on our research, that about $1 in $8 spent in retail in El Paso probably comes from the Mexican shopper. And in addition to the border restrictions, as far as not allowing retail or non-essential, which is that would be those individuals who come for a retail. But once they are able to come, the peso has depreciated substantially against the dollar. So the purchasing power for the Mexican shopper has evaporated to some extent. So even if they're able to cross the border, chances are they're going to think twice about doing some of those purchases because their goods, American goods and services, have gone up in price in peso determined prices. Looking at the payroll numbers in El Paso, in March, we saw a contraction of about 2.5%. The bulk of the contraction, as you can see on the chart here, again, came from leisure and hospitality, but quite frankly, was broad-based across many sectors. The unemployment rate ticked up in El Paso in March to 4.7%. We will get the April numbers at the end of next week, and we will see what those go. For Texas, the unemployment rate in March also ticked up to 4.7%. It is our estimate at the Dallas Fed that probably once we get the April numbers, the Texas unemployment rate will probably jump to 12.5 to 13% in April, based on what we see out there. So just to conclude this area and maybe go to some of the questions from the audience, is COVID-19, the pandemic, is unprecedented. There's still a lot of uncertainty, particularly about the length and the depth of this crisis, both from a public health perspective and from an economic perspective. Most economists expect the second quarter to be fairly rough for the US economy, unfortunately, but we expect growth to resume in the second half. And like I mentioned, it is likely that El Paso might be getting additional headwinds than the US economy. I would encourage everyone who's tuning in through Facebook or Zoom, if they can go to our website. We are continuously trying to learn how the economy is evolving, what are the new trends, what are the new things out there, and we're putting all of that intelligence and all of that research on our website. So please check our website and on a regular basis and keep up with our analysis with respect to the economy. So let me stop there and turn it back to you. And I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Well, thank you so much for putting that together. That was very impressive. I was following along kind of like this, so I could catch all of it. So I know that you covered a lot of stuff, and you did it in a very timely manner, so that you would be able to cover everything. But so basically, the concern is that Texas and El Paso will more than likely experience the effects of COVID a little bit more than the rest of the United States. And that's due to education levels as well as jobs. And we don't really have a lot of like big technological hubs here where the ability to work from home is always an option. So essentially, that's kind of what's putting us on track to really feel more of the effects of COVID.
Yes. So right now, I would say, for the Texas and for El Paso, that's absolutely right. The ability for the workforce to work from home is much more limited than the U.S. level. Locally here, we have additional challenges such as the digital divide. And we saw that with as kids went to start homeschooling, the school districts in El Paso did not go back after spring break. And we've been hearing a lot of pain points by families that as much as they would like their kids to be hooked up to and keep up with the work at school, it's hard for them because they either don't have the hardware or they don't have the broadband to be able to do that. So yes, there's additional challenges that Texas and El Paso are facing in the wake of COVID.
Right. And before I was with the chamber, I was a teacher at Bell Elementary, go Bell Eagles, over by Bowie. And so one of the things that I always knew was whenever I would go to work, my phone would welcome me to Mexico and I could get no internet. So that's one thing that we were talking about when it came to the digital divide was, how does it work if you're in one of those areas where your provider doesn't really recognize that you're not in Juarez, and so your broadband is limited, if not completely unable to be used. So that's an excellent point that you brought up. So let me go ahead and get to some questions. Let me just remind the audience that this is Facebook Live, so please, any questions that you have, Mr. Coronado is very wise, and he has all the background information, and he can answer any of your questions. So please feel free to type in your question. I will be able to see it right away and get you an answer. So let's begin. So one of the questions that we had for you was El Paso has a large percentage of small businesses, a lot of mom and pop restaurants or businesses that are family owned. And many of them are going to be heavily impacted or have already been heavily impacted by the pandemic. Do you feel that this is going to change what the face of business or what business infrastructure looks like in El Paso?
I'm afraid it will. And it will, of course, it will depend for how long we're going to be in this space and how deep the crisis and how deep the contraction in activity is. But I'm afraid it will, because to your point, I mean, this crisis is really putting a lot of stress on, particularly on the smaller businesses, businesses that may not have the cash flow, may not have the resources to withstand some of the headwinds that they're facing right now. And so that's why, we at the Federal Reserve have put a lot of emphasis on trying to mitigate some of those forces by putting in programs that will be addressing to a great extent some of those challenges and some of those bridging those businesses to be able to get to the other side of COVID-19. And I know that the fiscal authorities have been doing quite a bit in that space as well. So the idea here is to really equip small businesses to withstand the crisis. But I'm afraid that once we get on the other side, perhaps some of the businesses may not be able to survive. Some of the businesses might actually be a lot stronger by the end of this, but I'm sure that there will be new businesses that will come up out of this. So when you look at the ecosystem, the idea is to have a strong ecosystem for the entrepreneurship minds and for the business leaders to be able to operate and thrive. But right now, no doubt, these are very difficult times for them. And by the time we finish this, I'm sure the landscape of the small business in El Paso is likely to look different.
Yeah, and you know what? Just as a comment, really, my uncle actually is a small business owner over in Las Cruces, and he does a lot of work. I know that his son, my cousin Alex, his kind of goal is to start a small business, and it worries me when I see the idea, the idea that this could be a changing face of what being a small business owner means, not just for my family, but of course for my baby cousin, but also because I think people are already hesitant to go out and start a new business, and with it being even more of a scary idea, I feel like maybe it's going to scare people off and make them less willing to take that risk of starting something really innovative.
It could, and I would say, in the very short run, in the very immediate term, the challenge could be lack of demand, lack of financing, and a financial constraint to be able to set up a new business or remain in business as we go through this. But then once we get on the other side, I think, to me, the biggest challenge for a business leader, for a business owner, is what is the economy going to look like after we are done with COVID? What is where is the consumer going to be? Are we going to, as consumers, going to change our behaviors as to how we entertain ourselves? How do we dine? How do we buy groceries? How do we go to buy clothes and automobiles? And how do we vacation? And so that's going to put chances are it's going to look different. How different and in which direction, it's hard to tell. So that brings a lot more uncertainty if you're trying to start a new business. In which direction should I go? So yeah, no doubt, these are very, very difficult times for business owners, or particularly for small businesses.
Right. Okay. And just to follow up to that, do you think that our region is going to see larger companies have a stronger presence since this is happening, and it's such a threat to small businesses?
It is possible, and my logic for the possibility comes from the ability to withstand the crisis. So I would imagine that the larger the business is, the more resources, the more capacity that business will have to go through the crisis and make it through the other end. And so it is likely that once we are back to business as normal, that we will have a stronger presence of larger or medium-sized businesses. But let's not forget the phenomenal entrepreneurship mindsets that we have in our community and the resilient mindsets we have in our community. So I would not be shocked that if after we are done with COVID, they'll resurrect and they'll figure out a new way to engage in the small business space. So it is likely that for a while, maybe it's medium to large business, perhaps may dominate the market, but I would not discount like I said, the entrepreneurship mindsets that we have in our community.
Right. We had Layla from Workforce Solutions come on, and she told us that the entrepreneur mindset has to be not to panic, but to pivot and figure out your goods and services in the midst of the crisis out.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a new creative way to kind of challenge yourself. We have a question from a viewer. Rocio Chacon would like to know, how long do you think it will take for not only our region, but the nation to recuperate from COVID economy-wise?
So that's a question we're asking ourselves as we speak. And I'm afraid we don't have a solid answer yet. I think we're still a lot that we don't know, particularly around the public health aspect. We don't, there's still a lot to need to be done as far as testing, as far as therapeutics, as far as hospital capacity. And so really having the ability to deal from a public health perspective first. Once we do that, my sense is that we will be able to instill a lot more trust and confidence in the consumer and in the business operator for them to go back into business, for them to go back into and start engaging in economic activity. And it's hard to tell when that would happen. I would imagine it's going to take us some time because, again, we talk about testing, therapeutics, and eventually, I mean, the ultimate goal, I believe, is immunization, vaccinations, and those things do take some time. So it's going to be some time. It'll be premature for me to point a date because, quite frankly, we don't know, and so that's something we are tracking very closely because once we go through the public health, then the social distancing measures will remain in place or will not remain in place depending where we are, and that's going to drive a lot of economic activity. So there's a lot of unknowns out there at this point.
Right, and with the news stream, I handle government relations, so every morning when I turn on the news, it's like, whoa, everything kind of comes at you. There's new information flying at you from all sides. So I mean, it's just one of those things where, I mean, the best guess you can give isn't even a guess, really. It's just too difficult to pinpoint.
Correct.
Again, we've gotten some questions, but I'm going to go ahead and let you know we're almost to the wrap up. So anyone who's watching, if you have questions, now's your chance. Mr. Coronado is more than willing to answer any of your questions. So please feel free. Don't be nervous. Don't be scared. We don't bite. And go ahead and post your questions. I can see them right away in real time. So go ahead. But Mr. Coronado, so how long can you predict And I know you kind of answered it, but I'm going to go ahead and just re-ask in a little bit of different terms. How long do you think that it's going to take for small businesses to see some stability? And do you think it's even safe at this point to project that time frame?
It is very hard to project that time frame because, again, I think the first step in those projections is the public health, and I think there's still, and quite frankly, I don't call myself an expert on the economic projections, much less on the health projections. So that's the first step to get us there. Um, and so it is likely that we're going to be doing business, we're going to be engaging in economic activity in a different way for some time. And it would also depend on which sector you are, right? So if you're in the restaurant business, or if you're in the fitness business, or if you're in the entertainment business, that's the recovery of your particular business sector. It's going to look very, very different. And I think, to me, the ultimate goal is for business leaders to make sure that they instill the trust and the confidence that then when the consumer walks through the door of their stores, that they are safe, that they're secure. And to me, if, to the extent they can do that, I would expect more customers to try to go and do that. Let's not forget that this is a consumer-driven economy. And I think a lot of us are sitting on the edge of our chairs trying to get out, trying to go back to our way of life before COVID-19. So, but many of us may not feel that safe yet. And so setting those expectations and managing that confidence is paramount, so that then businesses can resume their activities and their operations.
Right. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So as I had mentioned before, I was a teacher. I taught it at Bell Elementary. And so my first group of kiddos is now, they're gonna be, they're juniors at Bowie and Jeff. And so they're scattered throughout the South Side. So go South Side, go Bowie Bears. Um, and one of the things that as an El Pasoan, as someone who you know, one of the reasons I wanted to work for the chamber was because I saw the brilliance that my students had. And I wanted to make sure that when they graduated high school and they were looking for jobs, they would be able to have an opportunity to work in El Paso, and they would be able to be successful here and help their families. Because that was one thing I noticed when I worked on the South Side, was the love that that community has for one another, the love that families have for each other, and how brilliant my students were. You know, I can tell you, I still go to my students' football games and basketball games, and I mean, they're just a great group of kids. So when I started working for the chamber, it was very much in the idea that I wanted to create a community for my students to be able to grow here and not have to settle or not have to choose between moving away and staying here. So if there's anything that you can give as a piece of advice to these young people right now who may not have that, who may experience that digital divide, you know, they may not have that internet capacity to learn, they may not have the computer software to be able to keep up with these projects, and they may not have the family support that they need in some cases. What can you, as an El Pasoan, as someone who has been successful in the business community, what can you offer to these young people in El Paso right now who may be feeling that like as though they're invisible, as though they're unheard, and just feeling like they're not sure if they're going to have a good job opportunity?
Yeah, and I think having those thoughts and having those reflections are even more important in today's environment, because there's plenty of uncertainty, there's plenty of headwinds all of us are facing, and we really gotta go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what exactly am I gonna be doing in the next 5 years, in the next 3 years, in the next 10 years? I would say a few things, Sorry. I think, you know, your description of the community that you are alluding to, I'm afraid that that's similar description of the entire Borderplex community. This is a community that we are so rich and so uh, capable of doing phenomenal things, but sometimes, and I can speak for myself, we are worst enemies. and we don't believe in ourselves. We don't believe in that we can do things and we can do great things. Second, I think that we, to the extent that we don't believe we can do that, then we put ourselves our own limitations locally. And I've seen that in many cases on both sides, folks who really put a lot of limitations on themselves and folks that say, I have no limitations and the sky is the limit, right? And then the third aspect I would say is there's a lot of resources out there. And we oftentimes believe that there's no resource, that there's no help, there's no assistance, there's no support. You'll be shocked that there's plenty of resources, and you'll be shocked that if you knock at the door of someone, if you place a phone call, you say, I want a mentor, I want someone I can bounce an idea by, whether it's for a school, for a business idea that you may have for our entrepreneurships on the line here, people are willing to help. It's just a matter of you asking. And so I'm one of those that I've often asked, and I've been very fortunate to receive phenomenal feedback and insight. And it's because I go and ask. And to this day, no one has told me, I don't have time to talk to you, you're not important, I don't care. That's not the case. On the contrary, people are willing to go above and beyond to help you out in whatever it is that you are facing. So it's, believe in yourself and don't be afraid of ask for help. People are willing and ready to help out, whether you're in middle school, high school, or you are a business leader in our community.
Right. And I think you're right. I was, of course, because those are my babies.
Yeah. I'm with you.
On the south side.
I understand.
But you're right. El Paso is one of those really great communities. I lived in DC when I worked on Capitol Hill, and I can remember thinking like, wow, people don't say hi. Like when you pass by them, and it's weird. If you do say hi, they look at you like you're strange. So El Paso does have that really great, friendly type of feeling to it. So
we're a very resilient community. We're a very resourceful community, and we often don't give us credit for that, and we often don't leverage those phenomenal assets we have.
Right, and you're absolutely right. And I really appreciate you answering that, because I know a few of my students who are having some difficulties that have reached out, and I know that hearing someone successful like you say something like that really will give them that extra push to really be optimistic and push forward and look at the positive. Yeah. And our last question. So everyone, last question. If you have any questions you want to ask, now is the time to type it in. With our area relying so much on international commerce, with the bridges and with our, being the sister city of Juarez, do you feel that we're going to have a higher impact being so close to the border?
I'm afraid we're already feeling some of that pain as we are, sheltering at home or staying at home in our community and in Mexico. Those connections, those relationships, those transactions that took place may not be taking place right now. And so that's actually a headwind as we speak. But I do believe that on the other side of this, our partnerships with Mexico, our partnerships with Southern New Mexico are going to really pay us dividends. Something that we've lost sight a little bit of it is that we now have a US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in place. And so once we're ready to go back into business, it's going to be there for us, and that should stimulate growth into our community. And then the other thing too that we've been hearing a lot, and still too early to see and to tell where exactly the impact would be, is that because of the global pandemic, a lot of businesses, multinational businesses, are really thinking their strategy and really thinking their global supply chain. And they are wondering, is our current footprint the optimal footprint going forward? I don't know what that answer is, but it could be that for some businesses, the answer is no, and that they have to change the footprint. And it is likely that maybe some of those businesses will bring back more activity and more of that global supply chain into North America. And so to the extent that happens, that might actually be a tailwind, a substantial tailwind. It has the potential to be so once we're able to go back into the full recovery phase after COVID-19. So there's a few things that I believe are there in place that will help us go through perhaps a stronger recovery, but once we're ready to begin the recovery.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you so much, Mr. Coronado. I know that you have a very busy schedule. I appreciate you putting those slides together. I know I've seen in the comments that we've already posted your guys's website so that people can go on and check.
Beautiful.
Again, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to speak with us. And I just have one last question. This wasn't anything planned, so I'm going to throw you a curveball a little. This is just a question really for me that sounds a little selfish, but I'm a big reader, so I want to start asking everyone that we interview. You're my guinea pig. What is your favorite book? What is a book that lifts your spirits or inspires you, or a book that you really look to that kind of is a guiding light for you?
So lately, I've read a book and the author doesn't come in, but the title of the book is Habit. I'm a creature of habit. I have to have a routine. I have to do the same thing every day, day after day. That's the way I operate. That's the only way I can. I know I'm very squared and very boxed here, but this is a book about how you as individual, how businesses, a collective group of individuals, maybe a business, maybe a community, how cities or how countries actually fits. And I've read it a couple of times or more than a couple of times. And every time I go back to the book, I've learned something new and has really helped me to identify what are the good habits I have, but more importantly, what are the bad habits that I have and how do I go about changing them? I've been able to change a few of those. I still have a plenty on the to-do list, but that's a pretty, it has been a pretty insightful, a very practical help and advice that I've gotten from the book. So I would recommend that.
That's great. And I actually just got a habit calendar. So I
There you go.
actually track my habits every day. So don't
Yeah.
worry. I'm pretty square too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Coronado. We really appreciate
You're
it,
very welcome.
all your wisdom, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. You've really made this interview a joy. Thank you for all your questions, and to all of our viewers. And we will be back next week with some more interviews for you. Thank you so much.